Why was she always the first one in the yard long before the others arrived? No one ever asked. No one cared. To them she was just the quiet woman with the bucket and the rag, the soldier who scrubbed mud and grease from the undercarriage of armored vehicles while the Texas heat rose like a hammer over the Fort Hood motor pool. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that every sweep of her hand was more than cleaning. Every glance beneath the steel frame was more than maintenance. She wasn't just washing vehicles. She was searching, studying, waiting. Tears of Fedrich had learned to move without sound, to keep her presence muted, her voice short. At 29, she was already older than most of the enlisted maintenance crew around her. They laughed louder, griped louder, lived louder. She let them. That noise gave her cover. If they were joking about football scores or weekend bars, they weren't asking why she always checked the same stress points beneath every axle, or why she sometimes paused with her hand pressed flat against cold steel, as if listening for a secret only she could hear. For 18 months she had kept her head down, her shoulders slouched, her answers clipped. The record said she was nothing more than a staff sergeant in vehicle maintenance, assigned to Fort Hood after a vague transfer of duty. Her evaluations were good, too good, in fact. No mistakes, no missed checks, every inspection logged with precise detail. It made her supervisors suspicious in a casual way, the way someone might suspect a coworker of being overly ambitious. But they never looked deeper. Why would they? She was invisible. Fedrich, don't forget the wheel wells, Sergeant First Class Martinez barked from across the lot. He always did that, barked. Not because she needed reminding, but because men like Martinez couldn't stand silence. He had to fill it. He had to make himself heard. Yes, Sergeant, she answered flatly, not even glancing up. Martinez turned back to his clipboard, satisfied. He didn't see the faint tightening of her jaw. He didn't know that she'd already checked the wells, and more than that, she'd looked for something that had nothing to do with mud or dirt. Private Chen, one of the younger mechanics, drifted over with his usual easy curiosity. "Why do you always crawl under the back end first?" he asked. "It's just cleaning, right? No one else does that." Tears wiped grease from her fingertips, her expression neutral. "Habit," she said simply. But it wasn't habit, it was necessity. Her eyes flicked across the undercarriage again, tracing weld seams, stress points, armor joints. She was looking for the kinds of scars most soldiers wouldn't even notice. Blast marks, improvised explosive device attachment sites, unnatural bends in metal that whispered of sabotage, not wear and tear. Because here, in the safety of Texas, thousands of miles from any active combat zone, she had seen patterns repeating. Vehicles coming back from overseas with subtle modifications that didn't belong. Layers of armor welded where they shouldn't be, panels deliberately thinned in spots that no regulation manual would approve. Someone, somewhere, was weakening them, and Fort Hood was the entry point. But she couldn't tell anyone, not yet, not without proof. She remembered Afghanistan, the desert night heavy with the smell of cordite and burned oil. Her unit, 12 specialists, each trained in vehicle operations and counter-IED assessment. They were rangers, they had a mission, and one by one they had vanished into gunfire and silence. The world believed they were dead, and maybe they were except for her. She kept her hands busy so her mind wouldn't drift too far into that memory. She scrubbed, rinsed, logged details. Invisible, always invisible. The others laughed and sweated in the September heat. She stayed quiet. That was her armor. Then came Tuesday afternoon. She was crouched beneath a recently returned Humvee, working through her checklist, when the sound of polished shoes on gravel pulled her attention. She didn't look up right away. She didn't need to. She already knew no one in her crew moved with that kind of measured precision. Major General Bolinski, 2 stars on his collar, an aura that made conversation drop wherever he walked. He wasn't here for routine inspection. Generals didn't come down to the motor pool for routine. He paused a few feet from her. Tears kept working, every muscle in her body telling her to stay casual, to stay unseen. She checked the welds, the axle housing, the armor seams, each movement practiced, deliberate. And that's when it happened. He stopped watching the group and started watching her. The way she shifted from rear axle to blast panel. The way her fingertips ran along seams like she was reading a language in the steel. The precise order, the methodical sequence. Bolinski's eyes narrowed. He knew what he was seeing. Tears slid out from beneath the Humvee, brushing dust from her uniform, moving on to the next vehicle as if nothing were different. But this one, this heavily armored transport, required more than routine. She approached its rear assembly, hands steady, eyes focused, movements too deliberate to be anything like the others. Her palms pressed against armor joints. She tested mounting brackets with subtle force. She checked the spacing between windshield armor layers, tapped the deflection panels, ran her fingers across stress fractures invisible to untrained eyes. Bolinski watched every second. That wasn't maintenance. That was assessment, tactical vulnerability assessment, advanced armor inspection techniques that only one group of soldiers ever learned, and all of them had vanished in Afghanistan 3 years ago. He stepped forward. "Excuse me, Sergeant." Tears froze, then straightened instantly, snapping to attention. Her eyes locked on his collar, on the rank that gave him power to unmake 18 months of secrecy with one question. "Yes, sir." That inspection technique, his voice was low, curious, dangerous. "Where did you learn it?" For a heartbeat, the entire motor pool seemed to go silent. She could hear the faint hum of engines cooling in the afternoon heat. She could hear her pulse, steady but hard. "Standard procedures, sir," she answered evenly. But Bolinski shook his head. "No, that's not standard, that's Ranger methodology, advanced armor integrity checks." His gaze sharpened. "I should know, I helped write the program." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Tears said nothing. Her silence was its own armor, but inside her chest tightened. 18 months of hiding. 18 months of becoming the ghost everyone overlooked. And with one sentence it threatened to shatter. Bolinski studied her face, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he said, "Secure briefing room, now." Her heart pounded, but her footsteps were steady as she followed him across the lot, leaving behind the only disguise she had left, the quiet girl with the rag and the bucket. In the briefing room, the door shut. Sound dampeners activated. Classified files slid across the table, and the world she had built, the fragile safety of anonymity, crumbled under the weight of recognition. "Staff Sergeant Tzia Marie Fedrich," Bolinski began, reading her name slowly like a key unlocking a door. "According to your record, your standard maintenance. No combat deployments, no special training." He paused, eyes cutting into her. "But that's not your real file, is it?" She kept her face steady, but her posture shifted. Shoulders back, chin lifted. The slouch was gone. For the first time in 18 months, the Ranger in her stood visible. The silence stretched between them, heavy with truths unspoken. She could deny it. She could keep pretending. Or she could accept what his eyes already told her. The time for hiding was over. Her breath was slow, controlled. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low but unshaking. "The same network that killed my team is still out there, sir. I've seen their patterns, their fingerprints in these vehicles. They're here." Bolinski didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched her, letting the words settle into the air like the sound of distant thunder. And for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't invisible anymore. Why had she stayed hidden for so long? That was the question burning in General Bolinski's eyes. He sat across the secure briefing table, his hands folded, his silence heavier than his stars. Tears of Fedrich sat opposite, rigid but calm, her uniform dusted with grease and grit, her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd buried for 18 months. "The network didn't die with my team," she said quietly. "Their work didn't stop in Afghanistan, it shifted, adapted, now it's here." Bolinski's jaw tightened. He had seen deception, betrayal, sabotage in more wars than he cared to remember. But this, enemy fingerprints inside U.S. motorpools, vehicle modifications tailored not to strengthen but to weaken armor, that was rot at the core. "Explain," he said. Her fingers curled into fists on the table, then slowly released. She took a breath, steady, as if each word was pulled from a well she'd been guarding for years. "They know our armor specifications, exact placement of welds, stress tolerances. They know where to strike for maximum damage. Every vehicle that's rolled through Fort Hood I've checked, and I've found the same patterns. Unauthorized modifications disguised as depot repairs, armor weakened deliberately." Her eyes lifted to meet his. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind lowered lids or silence. Her gaze was steady. "Someone is feeding them everything. Our supply chain is compromised, and they've been using Fort Hood as a pass-through." Bolinski leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He'd suspected cracks in the system, but never this deep. "You've been collecting intelligence on this, alone." "Yes, sir," she answered, voice tight but controlled. "Not because I wanted to, because I had to. Rangers don't abandon missions." The last line wasn't spoken with arrogance. It was spoken like an oath carved deep into bone. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the dampeners filled the space like a low storm. Finally, Bolinski opened the classified file in front of him. "Operation Mountain Thunder," he said. Her jaw flexed. "Your unit, 12 specialists, deployed for counter-IED assessments, deep reconnaissance. Lost contact after enemy overran the compound. Satellite showed no survivors. All personnel declared KIA." His eyes searched hers. "Except you." Tears' throat tightened. She could still smell the fire, the scorched steel, hear the stuttering bursts of gunfire that cut through the night like lightning. One by one, her team silenced. Their calls over comms, their voices fading into static. She had crawled through that rubble, her body broken, her ears ringing, her heart refusing to stop. "Just me," she said. The words were knives. But the mission didn't die there. Vehicle security assessment wasn't finished, and it won't be until the network is shut down. Bolinski tapped the file, his voice softer now, though still edged with steel. "Why didn't you report? Why 18 months of hiding under a maintenance cover?" Her eyes darkened, her voice dropping lower. "Because I couldn't trust the chain, sir. Not then. Maybe not now. Whoever's feeding them intel isn't just some depot worker with access. It's higher. Someone with clearance." Silence, heavy, suffocating. Finally, Bolinski pushed the file aside. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping once. "All right, Sergeant, you've carried this alone long enough, but you're not invisible anymore. I'm recalling you to active status, effective immediately." Her posture stiffened, but inside, a storm raged. Relief and dread colliding. Recognition meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. But it also meant something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She wasn't alone anymore. "Yes, sir," she said, voice clipped, but the faintest tremor of emotion edged through. The general leaned closer. "We'll go through your intelligence piece by piece, but first I need to know something." His eyes locked onto hers. "Why you? Why survive when no one else did?" The question struck harder than she expected. She looked away, her jaw trembling before she forced it still. Why her? She asked herself that same thing 1,000 nights, staring at barrack ceilings, haunted by faces she couldn't forget. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice nearly breaking. "But if I was spared, it wasn't for nothing." Bolinski nodded once, not sympathy, recognition. He knew that burden. He'd carried it himself in different deserts under different skis. He stood. "You'll brief me tomorrow at 600. Bring everything. Notes, logs, memory, whatever you've got." "Yes, sir." As he opened the door, she caught the faintest shift in his expression. Respect. Not the performative kind. The kind that only came when one soldier recognized another who'd carried a weight too heavy to name. When he left, she remained seated, her body still rigid but her hands shaking under the table. 18 months of silence, cracked open in one afternoon. For the first time since Afghanistan, the mission was alive again. The barracks felt smaller that night. Shadows stretched longer, air heavier. Tears sat on her bunk, staring at the notebook she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her trunk. Pages filled with sketches of armor layouts, lists of modifications, maps of shipment routes. Every line, every mark, written in silence. Her hands hovered over it as if afraid to open. Once she gave this over, there was no going back, no more invisibility. She exhaled slowly, then began reviewing the data. Vehicle after vehicle, the same anomalies, weakened seams, misplaced armor plates, thinned panels. She remembered each discovery, each subtle clue that someone, somewhere, was orchestrating a deliberate pattern of vulnerability. Her chest tightened. This wasn't sabotage for profit. This was preparation, a battlefield waiting to happen. Sleep never came. At dawn, the motorpool stirred again, soldiers joking, complaining, wiping sweat from their brows as the Texas heat rose. To them, it was just another day. To her, it was a reckoning. She moved through the routine, bucket and rag in hand, the mask of invisibility still in place. Martinez barked at her again. Chen asked another harmless question. She nodded, answered, played her part. But her mind wasn't here. Her mind was in that briefing room, with the general, with the file that said she was dead. And soon, with the truth she could no longer keep to herself. Why had she kept silent so long? Maybe because silence was survival. Maybe because shadows were safer than light. But as she scrubbed the mud from another wheel well, she realized something had shifted. The moment Bolinski recognized her, the moment he said, silence cracked. For 18 months she had carried a secret war alone, but wars were never won alone. And for the first time, she let herself believe. Maybe this time she wouldn't have to. Why did the briefing room feel colder than any place she had been in Texas? Maybe it was the walls, reinforced, silent, sealed from the outside world. Maybe it was the weight of memory pressing against her ribs, or maybe it was simply because for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding. Tears of Fedrich sat with her notebook spread open, every page covered in sketches, annotations, maps, and codes only she could read. Across the table, Major General Bolinski sat with his aide, both men silent, eyes tracing the marks. The aide's pen tapped nervously. Bolinski didn't move. He absorbed. "These are 18 months of observations," Tears said, her voice low but clear. "Every irregularity, every modification, every shipment routed through Fort Hood. None of it matches standard protocols." The aide looked skeptical, flipping through pages. Could be sloppy depot work, incompetence. Her jaw flexed. Incompetence doesn't repeat itself in identical patterns across dozens of vehicles. Incompetence doesn't know where to thin the armor to maximize blast penetration. This is deliberate. Bolinski raised a hand, silencing his aide. His eyes were on her, steady, weighing. "Go on." She leaned forward, her finger tracing one of the sketches, an armored Humvee undercarriage. "Here, armor plate should be welded flush, but these seams leave a 6-inch vulnerable span. Blast charges placed here funnel force directly under the cabin. Survivability drops by 60%. I've found the same configuration in 14 vehicles over the last year." The aide shifted uncomfortably. Bolinski's face remained unreadable. "And here," she flipped to another page, an MRAP diagram. "Weapon mount brackets spaced too close. Under stress they shear. Looks like an error, but it's been repeated exactly across shipments months apart. Whoever's doing this isn't just weakening armor, they're ensuring predictability. If enemy forces know these flaws exist, they can design attacks with surgical precision." The room fell into silence. Bolinski finally exhaled, his tone slow, deliberate. And you've been tracking this without authorization." "I wasn't waiting for permission, sir," she said, her voice tightening. "My team died chasing this network. Rangers don't abandon objectives. If command declared me dead, fine, but the mission stayed alive." His gaze flicked to the notebook again. "You're certain it's not isolated tampering?" Her eyes hardened. "No, sir. This is systemic. Someone inside is feeding our specifications, and someone is ensuring vehicles routed through Fort Hood carry those flaws." The aide spoke again, hesitant. "That would require access at multiple levels: logistics, depot, procurement." "Exactly," she cut in. "This isn't one mole, this is a chain." Bolinski sat back, fingers steepled, his silence stretching long. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Recognition from him was one thing, but belief, that mattered more. Finally, he nodded once. "Then we'll tear the chain apart." Her chest tightened, not with relief but with the sharp edge of possibility. For the first time since Afghanistan, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting again. When she left the secure room, the sun was blinding. The motor pool was alive with routine. Engines rumbling, voices shouting, Martinez barking orders as if the world was simple. For them, maybe it was. For her, every noise carried a shadow. Private Chen waved as she passed. "Hey, Sergeant, you're late today." She gave him a faint nod, nothing more. Her cover still stood, but the edges were crumbling. Bolinski knew, and soon others would too. That night, lying on her bunk, she stared at the ceiling and felt the memories claw their way back. Afghanistan. The night sky lit with fire, the compound torn apart, her team's voices vanishing one by one. She had crawled through blood and sand, dragging herself from wreckage, her ears ringing so loud she thought she'd gone deaf. Why her? Why survive? The question gnawed at her in the silence. She had no answer, only the mission. The next morning, she returned to the briefing room with more than her notebook. She carried a small box, dented, scarred. She set it on the table without a word. Bolinski raised a brow. "What's this?" "Evidence," she said softly. She opened the box, revealing shards of metal scorched and bent. "Fragments from vehicles I inspected. I kept them when I could, pieces no one would miss. Look here." She handed him a jagged panel, running her finger along its edge. "This weld was never reinforced, intentionally thinned. This isn't battle damage, it's sabotage built into the frame." The aide took it, examining closely. His expression shifted from doubt to unease. Bolinski studied her, then the fragments, then her again. "You risked exposure collecting these." "I risked exposure every day I stayed silent," she answered. The room went quiet. Bolinski finally leaned forward. "All right, you've convinced me. This isn't coincidence, and if it's deliberate, we're looking at treason." Her stomach tightened at the word, treason. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was blood, steel, betrayal. "Sir," she said, her voice low, steady, "they're preparing for something. These flaws aren't random. They're laying groundwork for mass casualties. If this network isn't stopped, every soldier riding out in these vehicles is already marked." The weight of her words hung heavy. Bolinski straightened. "Then we'll stop them, but we move carefully. If the chain runs deep, one wrong step warns them we're onto it." Her eyes narrowed. "What's our first move?" He gave her a long, steady look. "First, we test loyalty. I'll assign you to inspect an incoming convoy quietly. You'll identify every flaw, every anomaly. We'll cross-check it against depot records. If they don't match, we'll know where to start pulling threads." She nodded. Mission clear, direct. For the first time in years, she had a commander again. But in her chest, she knew this wasn't just reconnaissance. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. That evening, she stood in the motor pool as the convoy rolled in. Engines thundered, dust rising in waves. Soldiers cheered the return of vehicles fresh from overseas. To them, it was routine. To her, it was war disguised as routine. She moved among them with her clipboard, her rag, her silent mask. On the surface, she was just the maintenance sergeant checking off boxes. But her eyes caught every irregular seam, every misplaced weld, every scar whispering sabotage. One vehicle in particular made her pause. The armor seams were textbook wrong, too clean, too deliberate. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the steel's story. This wasn't incompetence. This was design. Her chest tightened. Whoever was feeding these flaws wasn't careless. They were precise, surgical. She logged the anomaly, moved on, logged another. And another. By the end of the inspection, her clipboard was filled with silent screams. She handed the log to Bolinski under cover of night, their exchange brief, unremarkable to any observer. But in her chest, the storm grew. This wasn't just infiltration, it was infestation. Why had no one else seen it? Maybe because they weren't looking. Maybe because the system trained them to see routine, not patterns. Or maybe because the betrayal was so deep, no one wanted to believe. But she had believed, she had seen, she had carried it alone for 18 months. And now, as the Texas night closed around her, and the weight of her findings pressed heavier than ever, she realized something. She wasn't invisible anymore. And once a ghost steps back into the light, there is no returning to shadows. Why did the convoy logs look so clean? Too clean. That was the first thought that hit tears of Fedrich as she sat in the dimly lit secure room, stacks of paperwork spread before her like puzzle pieces waiting to be forced into place. General Bolinski stood at her side, arms folded, eyes scanning the same sheets. On paper, nothing was wrong. Every weld, every modification, every depot note was accounted for, officially. But her own inspection notes told a different story. Pages filled with flaws, seams misaligned, armor thinned, panels compromised. She pressed her finger against the discrepancies, her voice tight but steady. See this vehicle? Armor seam logged as reinforced, but I checked it myself, thinned deliberately. The aide leaned forward, brow furrowed. Then the logs were altered. Bolinski didn't speak at first. He traced the line of the report with his finger, then set the page down. His silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. Finally, he said, which means someone inside the depot is falsifying records, higher clearance than a mechanic, someone with authority. Tears's chest tightened. She had suspected this, but hearing it out loud gave it weight. Proof. Bolinski looked at her. You've been tracking the pattern. Tell me, what do you see? She swallowed, then spoke. It's structured. Every third shipment carries flaws, not random, not scattered. They're distributed, balanced, almost like someone doesn't want the pattern noticed. But the spacing is too precise. Whoever's doing this knows logistics, knows how to bury sabotage under routine. The aide scribbled notes, his pen scratching fast. Bolinski's eyes didn't leave hers. So this isn't just sabotage, this is orchestration. Yes, sir, she said, her voice softened. And whoever it is, they're smart, smarter than we want to admit. For a long moment, the room was silent but for the hum of the dampeners. Then Bolinski said, almost to himself, which means the betrayal runs higher than depot level. That night Tears walked back across base under the orange haze of security lights. Soldiers laughed near the barracks. A football game echoed from a common room. For them, the world was simple. For her, it was a web. Every laugh, every sound muffled beneath the weight of what she knew. She thought of Afghanistan again. The ambush, the compound, her team falling one by one. She had wondered for 3 years how the enemy had known their vehicle security assessments, how they had placed charges in exactly the right spots. Now, as she walked under the Texas sky, the answer was clearer than ever. It hadn't been luck, it had been betrayal. And the same betrayal had followed her home. The next morning she stood in the motorpool again, rag in hand, her routine unchanged on the surface. Martinez barked orders. Chen asked another casual question. She gave the same flat answers. Invisible, always invisible. But as she scrubbed the mud from a wheel well, her mind was far from here. She was replaying the logs, the flaws, the patterns. 18 months of silence now sharpened into a blade. Then something caught her eye. A clipboard left on a nearby workbench. Routine paperwork left carelessly by a depot liaison who just walked off. She glanced around. No one watching. She moved closer, casual, her rag still in hand. The paperwork was standard processing forms, but one signature froze her breath. Captain Dwyer, logistics officer, clearance high enough to sign off on depot inspections. Her stomach tightened. She'd seen that name before, in her notebook. A supply run 3 months ago, vehicles routed under his authority. That same shipment carried 3 of the most suspicious modifications she'd ever logged. She stepped back, her hand trembling slightly as she forced the rag back to the wheel well. Invisible, still invisible. But her mind was no longer on the grease beneath her nails. It was on the name, now burning through her thoughts. Captain Dwyer. That evening she met Bolinski again. The briefing room was darker this time, only a desk lamp casting shadows across the table. She laid her notebook open, tapping a line of notes. Captain Dwyer's name keeps surfacing. Every 3rd shipment I flagged, signed by him. Bolinski's brow furrowed. He leaned in, scanning the notes. He's logistics, trusted. He's been here for years. That's why it works, she said quietly. No one questions him, but the pattern is there. His shipments carry the flaws. His logs don't match my inspections. The aide shifted, uneasy. Could it be coincidence? Tears's eyes hardened. Coincidence doesn't repeat with mathematical precision. Bolinski sat back, exhaling slowly. His silence stretched, the kind that filled a room with weight. Then finally he said, if Dwyer's involved, we don't confront him, not yet. If the chain runs higher, he's just one link. We need proof, hard proof. Her voice was steady, but her chest was tight. Then let me watch him, quietly, see where he moves, who he meets. Bolinski studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Careful, if he's part of this, he's already cautious. One slip and you vanish for good this time. She gave the faintest ghost of a smile. I've already been a ghost once, sir. I know how to walk unseen. The following days blurred into routine shadow work. She still washed vehicles, still logged details, still wore the mask of invisibility. But now her eyes tracked every movement of Captain Dwyer. She noticed the way he lingered near certain shipments, the way he left base late, always alone, always on foot, walking toward the edge where the depot fences met the outer road. She noted the times, the patterns. And one night she followed. The moon hung low, shadows deep across the asphalt. She moved silently, every step measured, her breath steady. She stayed just far enough to keep him in sight, just close enough not to lose him. He reached a side gate, unmarked, not guarded at this hour. He slipped through. Tears froze, her pulse hammering, unauthorized movement, outside the wire. She hesitated only a second before following. On the other side, the world felt different. The hum of the base gave way to the vast quiet of Texas night. Crickets, whined through scrub, and the faint crunch of Dwyer's boots ahead. She crouched low, moving along the shadow of the fence. He walked toward a parked vehicle, a civilian truck, dust-coated, engine idling low. A figure stepped out to meet him, tall, hooded, face hidden. Her breath caught. The 2 men spoke in low tones, their words carried away by the wind. She edged closer, straining to hear. Only fragments reached her. Shipment next week. Same welds. A safe route. Her chest tightened. It was real. It wasn't paranoia. Dwyer was in contact with someone outside, someone feeding the network. She reached into her pocket, pulling the small recorder Bolinski had given her. She pressed it on, holding it steady, capturing every word she could. Then headlights cut through the dark, another vehicle approaching. Her pulse spiked, too many variables, too much risk. She ducked lower, pressed against the dirt, heart hammering. The truck door slammed. Dwyer climbed in. The hooded figure followed. The approaching headlights slowed, flashed once, then the vehicles pulled away into the night. She lay there, breath shallow, the recorder still running in her hand. And in the silence that followed, one thought seared through her mind. The betrayal wasn't just in the depot. It wasn't just one man. It was organized, connected, growing. And she was standing in the middle of it. Why had she followed him? Maybe because ghosts can't stay hidden forever. Maybe because the mission demanded it. Or maybe because somewhere deep inside she was tired of silence. But as she made her way back through the shadows, the recorder pressed tight in her fist. She knew one thing for certain. The conspiracy was larger than she feared, and she had just stepped into its path. Why did the air around her feel thicker now, as if every movement carried weight? Maybe because the night she'd followed Dwyer, something had shifted. Until then she'd been observing from shadows, her presence folded into routine. Now she'd crossed an invisible line. She stepped into their world. Back in her barracks, she sat on the edge of the bunk, the small recorder in her hand. Its red light blinked faintly, as if it were pulsing with her heartbeat. She hadn't dared play it yet. Some part of her feared hearing those fragments again, feared confirming the betrayal with her own ears. But she pressed play. Static, then voices. Dwyer's unmistakable tone, low and brisk. Shipment next week, another voice, muffled but firm. Same weld's safe route. Her stomach clenched. It was real. No misinterpretation, no paranoia. She stopped the recording, breathing slow. She knew she needed to get it to Bolinski immediately. But some instinct, an old Ranger instinct she'd learned before Afghanistan, told her to wait. Instinct saved lives when plans fell apart. She hid the recorder beneath the lining of her duffel. Then she lay back, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios. Dwyer wasn't acting alone. He met someone outside, someone with access to the routes. That meant the network reached beyond the base, beyond Fort Hood. And if they suspected she was onto them, she wouldn't get another night like this. At 500 she was back at the motor pool. The same routine, the same silence, the same sweat under Texas sun. But now she felt eyes on her. She couldn't tell if it was paranoia or truth. Martinez barked his usual orders. Chen asked his usual questions. Everything was normal, too normal. She scrubbed mud from the undercarriage of an MRAP, her mind replaying the meeting in the dark. She thought of the way Dwyer had glanced over his shoulder once, briefly, like a man who knew he wasn't alone. Had he seen her? Did he suspect? The thought sent a tremor through her, but she forced her hand steady. Her cover was her lifeline. As long as she stayed the quiet maintenance sergeant, she was safe. Or at least safer. That evening, she met Bolinski again in the secure room. She handed him the recorder. He listened in silence. Static, then voices, then fragments of betrayal carried by Texas wind. When it ended, he set the device down slowly. His expression was grim. "That's enough to open an investigation," he said, "but not enough to convict." She leaned forward. "We don't have time for procedure. If next week's shipment carries the same flaws, soldiers will die." His eyes met hers, steel on steel. "I know, but we move wrong, we lose him. And if the chain runs higher, we lose everything." Her voice hardened. "Then let me get closer." Bolinski shook his head. "No, you're already exposed. You can't risk." She cut him off, her voice low but sharp. "I've been risking it for 18 months, sir. This is no different." Silence stretched between them. Then slowly he nodded. "We'll set up surveillance. You stay your cover. Watch his movements but don't engage." She exhaled, the tension in her chest only tightening. "Understood." As she left, his voice followed her. "Ranger," he said quietly, "don't let them see you coming." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "They won't." The next days blurred into a pattern of tension, wound tight. She watched Dwyer without appearing to. She logged vehicles while her eyes tracked his footsteps. She scrubbed armor seams while her ears caught fragments of his conversations. He was careful now, more careful than before. He still signed off on shipments, but he no longer lingered near the motor pool. He avoided casual conversation. He left at odd hours, always alone. She began noting times and locations. Patterns emerged like faint outlines beneath water. He wasn't just meeting one person. He was meeting several. The network wasn't a single chain. It was a web. And each thread led outward, away from Fort Hood. One night she followed again. This time she stayed farther back, moving slower, every step measured. The Texas sky stretched wide above her, stars sharp and cold. Dwyer reached the same unmarked gate. But tonight, two vehicles waited. One a civilian truck like before, the other a dark SUV with tinted windows. She crouched low behind a stack of pallets, her recorder running. Dwyer spoke in hushed tones to a man from the SUV. The hooded figure from before stood nearby, silent. Specs delivered, all clean. Payment processed, next phase. Her chest tightened. Next phase, the words burned into her mind. Then, abruptly, the hooded figure turned his head, directly toward her hiding spot. Her pulse spiked. Had he seen her? He murmured something to the man by the SUV. Dwyer glanced back over his shoulder. She pressed herself lower, her body flat against the dirt. The SUV door opened. A third man stepped out, his silhouette broad, his posture military. He scanned the shadows with slow precision. Her heart hammered. She stayed still, her breath shallow. Ghost again, invisible again. After a long moment, the man turned back to the group. The conversation resumed. She didn't move, not yet. Finally, the vehicles pulled away, disappearing into the night. She exhaled shakily, her fingers digging into the dirt. They knew someone was watching. They didn't know who, not yet. But the noose was tightening, around them, around her. Back in the barracks, she stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who'd arrived at Fort Hood with a bucket and a rag. Her shoulders were squared again, her eyes sharp. The ranger in her had resurfaced. But so had the ghosts. She thought of her team. Their faces flickered across her mind like old film reels. She thought of the night they'd died. She thought of the promise she'd made, crawling through rubble, her body broken but her will unbroken, finish the mission. And now, for the first time, she wondered if finishing it would mean surviving it. At 600, she met Bolinski again. She laid the second recording on the table. He listened, his jaw tightening at the words next phase. When it ended, he looked at her. They're planning something bigger, not just weakening armor, something coordinated. Her voice was low, steady. We're running out of time. He nodded. We need names, faces, proof. She hesitated, then said, let me in closer, let me make contact. Bolinski's eyes narrowed. That's not a reconnaissance request, that's infiltration. She held his gaze. Yes, sir. He studied her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. You've been a ghost for 18 months. If you go in, you might not come back. She smiled faintly, a shadow of something hard. I wasn't supposed to come back the first time either. Silence. Finally he said, I'll think on it. She stood, saluted. Yes, sir. Why was she pushing this? Maybe because every day she waited, soldiers rolled out in compromised vehicles. Maybe because every day she hesitated, the network tightened its web. Or maybe because somewhere deep inside, she was tired of being invisible. But as she walked back to the motor pool, the sun rising hot and unforgiving over Fort Hood, one thought echoed louder than all the others. The next phase was coming, and she had to be inside it before it arrived. Why did the word infiltration sound less like a tactic and more like a heartbeat now? Because this wasn't a plan on paper anymore. It was a path she'd been walking for years without realizing it. Every silent inspection, every hidden note pushing her closer to the center of the web. And now, finally, She was about to step inside. Tears of Fedrich sat in the dark of the secure briefing room, the recorder and her notebook laid out between her and General Bolinski. His face was lined with fatigue, his uniform crisp but his eyes shadowed. He'd been turning her request over for hours, weighing risk against necessity. "You're sure about this?" he said quietly. "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady but low. "If I stay on the outside, I keep seeing only pieces. If I get closer, I can see the whole picture." Bolinski's jaw tightened. "Closer means exposed. Once you're inside, I can't protect you. No one can." She met his gaze without blinking. "I haven't been protected for a long time." For a long moment he just looked at her as though trying to measure the weight of everything she'd carried. Then he nodded once sharp. "All right, we do this your way, but not without a lifeline." He slid a small device across the table, a micro-transmitter the size of a coin. "We'll keep you under passive surveillance. No active comms, they'd catch it, but if you can drop a signal, anything, we'll move." She picked it up, rolling it between her fingers. "Understood." Bolinski leaned forward. "This isn't a hero's job, Ranger. This is survival with a mission attached. You move when you can, you pull back if you have to." Her lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "That's what they taught us, sir. Complete the mission but come home if you can." He almost smiled back, almost. The plan was simple on paper. She'd let herself be noticed not as a threat but as an asset. Feed them enough to believe she was useful, someone who could slip them details from inside maintenance operations. They'd draw her in, and when they did, she'd see their faces, their roots, their methods. But simple on paper never meant easy in the field. For 3 nights she prepared, rehearsing the cover story in her head, practicing the way her voice would break just enough to sound believable. She was a soldier overlooked, a sergeant with access to vehicles, tired of being invisible, ready to trade information for money, for purpose, for something. Every detail rehearsed, every breath calculated. But nothing prepared her for the first step. It happened on a Thursday night. Dwyer was moving again, this time later than usual, his stride faster, his head down. Tears followed, farther back than before, the micro-transmitter tucked under the lining of her boot. The night air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of oil and dust. The unmarked gate loomed ahead. Dwyer slipped through without hesitation. She waited, counted to 30, then followed. On the other side, 2 vehicles waited again, different makes, same formation. The hooded figure was there, and another man she hadn't seen before, younger, eyes sharp even in the dark. She crouched low behind a stack of crates, heart steady, breath shallow. Dwyer handed over a folder. The hooded figure glanced at it, then at Dwyer. "And the inspector?" he asked, his voice low but clear enough to carry. Her stomach tightened. "She's routine," Dwyer said. "Just a grunt, doesn't know what she's looking at." The younger man smirked faintly. "Everyone's looking at something, even grunts." The hooded figure's gaze swept the shadows again. "If she becomes a problem," he let the words trail off. Dwyer's face stayed blank. "She won't." Her pulse spiked, but she didn't move. The hooded figure closed the folder, tucking it under his arm. "Next shipment leaves Saturday. Final prep tomorrow night." He turned, about to step into the SUV, when tears stood up. The move surprised even her, but she knew the window was closing. If she didn't step in now, she'd lose them. "I can make that easier," she said, her voice carrying across the space, calm but firm. Every head turned. Dwyer froze. "Sergeant," his voice was tight. "What are you?" She stepped closer, slow, deliberate, hands visible. "You've been cutting corners for months, weakening armor, slipping modifications through. I see things, Captain, more than you think." The hooded figure's posture shifted, predatory but curious. "And?" She let a faint tremor enter her voice, just enough to sell the story. "And I'm tired of being invisible. You're smart. You're getting paid. I've been doing the work. Maybe it's time I got something out of it too. Silence heavy. The younger man's eyes narrowed. Why now? She shrugged casual. Why not? You've got shipments, I've got access, seems like a fair trade. The hooded figure studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice low. You're bold. I'm practical, she said. Another silence. Then the hooded figure nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Saturday, you'll help load. If you're useful, there's more. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Understood. The hooded figure stepped into the SUV. The younger man followed. Dwyer lingered, his expression unreadable, then turned and climbed into the truck. Engine started, tires crunched on dirt, the vehicles pulled away. She stood alone in the dark, her pulse hammering, the microtransmitter warm against her boot. She'd done it, she was inside. Back in her barracks, she sat on her bunk, staring at her hands. They were steady now, not shaking like they had after Afghanistan, not trembling like they had after her first inspection at Fort Hood. Steady, focused. But inside, the storm raged. She just stepped into a network that had killed her team, a network that could kill her as easily as flipping a switch. She thought of Bolinski, of his warning. Once you're inside, no one can protect you. She whispered to herself, barely audible, complete the mission. The next day felt endless. She went through the motions, bucket and rag in hand, checking vehicles, logging details, invisible as ever. But under the surface, everything had changed. She could feel Dwyer's eyes on her once, twice, a flicker of doubt behind his practiced face. She didn't let her expression shift. She stayed the ghost. Saturday loomed like a storm cloud. That night she met Bolinski one last time before going in. She handed him a folded piece of paper, a crude map of the loading area, times, notes. Saturday night, they'll test me. This is where. He took it silently, his face grim. We'll be close, but no heroics, Ranger. We move only if you signal. She nodded. He hesitated, then said softly, You've already done more than anyone could ask. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she said, cutting him off gently. They killed my team. This is the mission. Bolinski's eyes flickered, pride, worry, something unspoken. Then he nodded once. Bring it home. Why had she volunteered for this? Maybe because she couldn't stand watching from the outside anymore. Maybe because ghosts only haunt until they find closure. Or maybe because deep down, she knew the only way to protect the soldiers who'd never even heard her name was to walk straight into the fire herself. As Saturday night approached, she sat on her bunk, her boots laced, her hands steady. The base outside was quiet. She closed her eyes, saw her team's faces one more time, heard their voices, felt the rubble under her hands. And then she opened her eyes, stood, and walked into the night. Why did silence weigh heavier when you chose to step into it yourself? Because now it wasn't just something imposed on her, it was something she had embraced. A mask, a shield. And as tears of Fedrich walked toward the loading area that Saturday night, silence wrapped around her like body armor. The lot was darker than usual, floodlights switched off, only a handful of portable lamps casting pale cones across the asphalt. Trucks lined in formation, crates stacked higher than her shoulders, and shadows moving with purpose. She adjusted her pace, steady, unhurried, as though she belonged here. Dwyer was already waiting, clipboard in hand. His expression was taut, his eyes sharper than before. You showed, he said flatly. She met his gaze, unflinching. I said I would. For a moment the air between them felt like a wire pulled tight. Then he gave a curt nod. Follow me. He led her toward the center of the lot. Two men she didn't recognize moved crates onto the back of a truck. The hooded figure from before stood nearby, his presence cold, calculating, while the younger man leaned against the bumper, arms crossed, eyes watchful. Tears kept her posture relaxed, her hands visible, ghost but not timid, quiet but not weak. The hooded figure's gaze cut into her. So, the invisible sergeant speaks. She didn't flinch. "You needed someone who sees what others miss. That's me." He studied her for a long beat, then gave a faint nod. "We'll see." The work began like routine logistics. Crates lifted, secured, manifests checked. But to her eyes it was all wrong. The crates weren't standard supplies. Their weight was off, their markings painted over. She brushed her fingers against one as she helped secure it, metal inside, dense, unfamiliar. Not weapons. Not exactly. Something heavier. She forced her hand steady, her face blank. Observation was survival. The younger man stepped closer, his smirk sharp. "Funny thing," he said. "Most soldiers don't volunteer for night work. What makes you different?" She glanced at him, voice calm. "Most soldiers don't see the flaws in their armor before anyone else does." His smirk faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. He leaned back, watching her with new calculation. Dwyer barked an order, snapping the moment. "Secure the rear load." She obeyed, tightening straps, logging every detail in her mind. The license plate numbers, the weight distribution, the route scrawled on a clipboard she glimpsed briefly, north, not south, towards civilian highways, not training grounds. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just about sabotaging military convoys. This shipment was leaving the base entirely. Hours stretched, the trucks filled, the men spoke little, their movements precise. This wasn't their first time. When the last crate was loaded, the hooded figure approached her. His presence was closer now, his voice low. "You know what happens if you cross us." She held his gaze, unshaken. "You wouldn't be testing me if you didn't already need me." Silence, then faintly he smiled beneath the shadow of his hood. "Saturday was a test, you passed. Next time it won't be crates." Her stomach nodded, but her expression didn't shift. Understood. He turned away, signaling the others. Engines roared to life. One by one, the trucks pulled out of the lot, their taillights disappearing into the Texas night. She stood in the shadows, the silence heavier than before, her pulse hammering against her ribs. When the last vehicle vanished, she slipped her hand into her boot, pressing the micro-transmitter once, twice, dropping the signal. It was faint, masked, but enough for Bolinski's team to know. Movement confirmed. Then she walked back toward the barracks, every step measured, her face expressionless. Inside, though, her chest burned. What were in those crates? Where were they headed? And why did the words "next time" feel like a blade hanging over her throat? In the secure room the next morning, Bolinski listened as she gave her report. Her voice stayed steady, clinical, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "They're moving shipments off base. Civilian routes. Cargo is dense, metallic, not standard issue. Markings painted over. Dwyer oversaw loading. Hooded contact ran the operation. Younger male, unknown. They trust me enough to bring me closer." Bolinski's expression hardened with every word. "And the cargo?" She shook her head. "I couldn't confirm, but it wasn't ammo, too heavy, too precise." The aide leaned forward. "Explosives." She met his eyes. "Not the kind we know." Bolinski steepled his fingers, silent. Finally, he said, "You'll go back in. They're testing you, you gain their trust. We'll track the routes." Her jaw tightened. "And if the cargo isn't just meant for overseas?" The general's eyes darkened. "Then this isn't sabotage, it's attack planning." The words hung in the air like smoke. Back in the motor pool, routine pressed against her like a mask too tight. Martinez barked. Chen joked. Engines rumbled. Life went on. But to her, everything felt sharpened, dangerous. She caught Dwyer's eyes once across the yard. His face was unreadable, his posture casual. But in his eyes she saw it, suspicion. Testing never ended. Trust was never whole. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, was under scrutiny. And yet, part of her felt more alive than she had in years. Not because she wanted this, but because the mission had never felt clearer. That night she dreamed of her team again. Not the firefight, not the rubble, just their faces around a fire, their laughter cutting through Afghan night air. For a few seconds in the dream, they were alive, whole, watching her. When she woke, her cheeks were wet. She wiped them dry, sat up, laced her boots. There was no time for grief, not anymore. 2 nights later, they called her again. This time, no crates. This time, she was told to ride. She climbed into the back of a truck with the younger man beside her. His eyes were sharp, curious, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. The road stretched long under the Texas sky, headlights carving through the dark. Silence filled the cabin. She could hear the engines hum, the faint rattle of metal inside the crates. The younger man finally spoke. "You're calm for someone who doesn't know where she's going." She kept her eyes forward. "Calm keeps you alive." He studied her a moment longer, then gave a faint chuckle. "Maybe you're not as invisible as you think." She didn't answer. The convoy rolled north, past civilian roads, past small towns. The night grew darker, the air heavier. Finally, the truck slowed. They pulled into an unmarked warehouse, its doors yawning open, lights dim but steady. Inside, men moved with precision. Tools glinted, sparks flew. And then she saw it. One of the crates opened, its contents revealed under a harsh lamp. Not explosives, not weapons. Armor plates, U.S. issue, modified, pre-cut with flaws built in. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just sabotage. This was manufacturing betrayal. They weren't just altering vehicles. They were supplying enemies with blueprinted weaknesses, ready to be deployed anywhere, against anyone. She forced her expression still, her pulse thundering in her ears. The hooded figure appeared beside her, his voice low. "Now you understand." She turned her head slightly, meeting his shadowed gaze. "I understand." Inside, though, a storm broke open. Her team hadn't died by chance. Soldiers wouldn't die by chance. It was all by design. Why had she stepped into this? Maybe because she'd been following ghosts too long. Maybe because the mission had always been leading here. Or maybe because somewhere inside, she knew she couldn't keep pretending to be invisible forever. But as she stood in that warehouse, armor plates gleaming under stolen light, she realized something with bone-deep certainty. The next move she made wouldn't just expose the network. It would decide if she lived at all. Why did the warehouse smell like betrayal? Because every plate, every weld, every spark told a story of lives already marked for loss. And as tears of Fedrich stood among the shadows of men who had perfected the art of sabotage, she felt the weight of every ranger who had fallen before her pressing against her ribs. The hooded figure's voice cut through the clatter of tools. "You said you wanted more. This is more." She kept her face still, her voice steady. "You've been building flaws into armor, selling weaknesses as weapons." His shadowed face tilted, almost approving. "Not everyone sees it that quickly." Behind her, the younger man shifted closer, arms crossed. "Question is, what do you do with that knowledge? Because if you're with us, Sergeant, you'll never be invisible again. You'll be paid, protected, respected." The words echoed, almost mocking. Invisible, paid, respected. As if that was what her team had died for. She let the silence stretch as though considering. In truth, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The micro-transmitter pressed against her boot like a secret reminder. She wasn't completely alone. Bolinski's team would be listening, but they wouldn't move without her signal. And once she gave it, everything would burn. Hours dragged like years. She worked alongside them, securing plates, moving crates, memorizing every face, every route, every insignia scratched off and painted over. She listened more than she spoke, her ears tuned for fragments. Shipment east, a client's waiting overseas, final delivery before review. Her chest tightened at those last words. Final delivery. Review. This wasn't the end of a process. It was the beginning of deployment. If this shipment left, armor with built-in death would spread beyond Texas, beyond borders. At one point, the younger man handed her a wrench, his eyes narrowing. "Strap that plate. Let's see if you know what you're doing." She crouched, securing it with precision. Not too fast, not too perfect. Enough to pass, enough to survive. When she stood, his smirk was gone. He gave a faint nod. "Maybe you do belong here." Her stomach turned. Near midnight, Dwyer pulled her aside. His face was drawn, his eyes restless. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "This isn't your fight." She stared at him, unblinking. "It became mine the moment my team died." He flinched just barely. "You don't understand. They're too deep, too connected. You won't stop them." Her voice dropped sharp. "Then why are you here?" For a moment his mask cracked. Something like guilt flickered. But then it was gone, replaced by cold calculation. "Because surviving means choosing sides. I chose." She swallowed hard. "Then you chose wrong." Before he could answer, the hooded figure called out, pulling them back to work. By dawn, the trucks were loaded again, engines rumbling. The convoy was set to roll. The hooded figure turned to her, his voice low. "Tonight you proved your worth. Next time you won't just watch, you'll deliver." Her chest tightened. Deliver. The word wasn't logistics, it was complicity. She gave a curt nod, hiding the storm inside. As the trucks began to pull out, she pressed her heel hard against the transmitter in her boot. 3 times. The signal. Her throat was dry, her pulse unsteady. Now it was out of her hands. Either Bolinski's team was close enough, or she had just signed her own death warrant. The convoy rolled into the open road, dawn painting the horizon blood-red. She sat in the back of one truck, the younger man across from her, his gaze sharp, too sharp. He studied her like a predator watching prey. "You don't flinch much," he said, "even when you should." She forced her voice calm. "Flinching doesn't change outcomes." His smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, but it reveals loyalty." The words hung heavy. "A test, always a test." Then headlights, flashing once, twice in the distance. Not civilian, military. The convoy slowed, unease rippling through the men. Dwyer cursed under his breath. The hooded figure barked an order. "Keep moving." But it was too late. From both sides of the road, armored vehicles emerged, blocking the path. Soldiers in full kit stepped into view, weapons raised, formation tight. Bolinski's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Stand down, trucks are seized. This operation is over." Chaos exploded. The younger man reached for a weapon. Tears moved faster. Her hand struck his wrist, the pistol clattering to the floor. He snarled, lunging, but she drove her elbow into his ribs, her training instinctive, precise. The truck swerved, tires screaming. Shouts filled the air. The hooded figure leapt from the lead vehicle, sprinting for the ditch. Bolinski's men opened fire, not to kill, but to pin. Dirt erupted around him. Dwyer froze, his hands trembling. His eyes locked with hers, filled with something between fear and regret. "You could have stayed invisible," he whispered. She stared back, her voice like steel. "Ghosts don't stay ghosts forever." She slammed her boot into the transmitter again, hard. 3 more pulses, the final signal. Soldiers surged, doors wrenched open, men dragged from vehicles, weapons seized. The convoy collapsed in minutes, the network shredded in the dawn. When it was over, she stood by the roadside, her hands trembling now that it was safe to let them. The sun burned over the horizon, casting long shadows across the wreckage. Bolinski approached, his face grim but his eyes steady. "You did it, Ranger." She shook her head slowly. "Not me, my team. This was theirs before it was mine." For the first time his expression softened. He gave a slow nod. Soldiers moved around them, securing crates, cataloging evidence, cuffing men who had thought themselves untouchable. The hooded figure was dragged past, his mask torn away to reveal an ordinary face. Ordinary. That was the horror of it. Dwyer followed, his head lowered, his step slow. He didn't look at her. She watched him pass, her chest heavy. Betrayal wasn't always a monster. Sometimes it was just a man who chose wrong. Later in the secure room, she sat across from Bolinski once more. The files lay between them, the evidence overwhelming now. Supply chains mapped, faces identified, weaknesses catalogued. The network exposed. But she felt no triumph, only exhaustion, only weight. "You'll be commended for this," Bolinski said quietly. "Your name will be cleared, officially." Her lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "And unofficially." He met her eyes. "Unofficially, you carried a mission no one else even knew existed. Alone, that won't be forgotten." She looked down at her hands, scarred from work, steady now. For the first time in years, steady. "Sometimes," she said softly, "being invisible is what saves you. But sometimes it's what kills you." Bolinski studied her, then gave a slow nod. "So what now, Sergeant?" She lifted her eyes, her voice quiet but unshaking. "Now the vehicles are safe. The mission is finished." And for the first time, she let herself breathe. That night, lying in her bunk, she dreamed of her team again. But this time there was no fire, no rubble, no gunfire. Just their faces, calm, proud, fading into the Texas night. She whispered into the dark, words only they could hear. "We finished it." And sleep came easier than it had in years. Why had she endured? Why had she carried silence so long? Not for recognition, not for revenge, but because dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes, the ghosts who step back into the light don't return to shadows. They finish what they started,